Hello and assalamu alaikum. If somebody was to blindfold you without you realizing, and then suddenly you woke up on a plane, would you not be curious and ask yourself, what am I doing here? Who put me here? And where am I going? You see, atheism raises many problems, and this is one of them. It convinces you that you do not need to ask these questions, and you don't need to be inquisitive. You are put on this planet. Are you not curious enough to ask yourself, what am I doing here? Who put me here? And where am I going? We will mention 3 problems atheism raises, and 2 logical arguments for belief in God. Problem number 1 is the first problem you mentioned earlier. It forces you to be ignorant. It doesn't encourage you to ask the questions of, what am I doing here? Who put me here? And where am I going? Second problem is there is no objective moralism. What is objective moralism? Objective moralism is the idea that we know what is considered right or wrong based on God's guidance. We can say murder is wrong because God said so. We can say charity is good because God said so. Without belief in God, you cannot have objective moralism. It's impossible. You are bound by something called subjective moralism. Subjective moralism means that there's no clear guidelines as to what is right or wrong. Without a belief in God, you could say that murder is good and you can't question that person. You can say charity is bad and you can't question that person. Because without clear guidelines and objective moralisms, there's no such thing as right or wrong. The third problem is without objective moralism, society will crumble. There will be no rule book. You'll make your own rules. And you could use your own imagination to think how destructive society would become if there were no rules. Now moving on, we'll give 2 main logical arguments for belief in God. Number 1, the teleological argument, also known as the design argument. Within this argument, there is a famous analogy known as the William Paley watchmaker analogy. So here's the story. William was walking and noticed there's a rock on the floor and thought, where has this come from? Then he just says, probably got here by itself and has been here a while. Then he continues to walk and he notices a watch on the floor. Then he thinks to himself, this watch is way too complex for it to just appear by chance. It must have an intelligent designer. So if the watch is too complex to just appear by chance, then what about the universe? For example, if the critical density of the universe was off by 1/10 to the power of 15, then the entire universe would discombobulate. Let's put this number in context. This is like getting 10 trillion pennies in a pile. And from these 10 trillion pennies, there is just 1 penny which is painted red. And you must pick out this red penny from the 10 trillion pennies while blindfolded. So this example I have given is like the equivalent of the universe being the way it is without an intelligent designer. The second argument is the contingency argument. For argument's sake, let's say there are 2 types of existences. Number 1, contingent. Number 2, necessary. The first one, necessary existence. Necessary existence means that it's impossible for this existence to not exist. Second type, contingent existence, means something which doesn't have to exist and is dependent on something else for it to exist in the first place. It's logically possible that the entire universe doesn't have to exist, and therefore the universe exists contingently. Another example, my phone. My phone doesn't have to exist, and for it to exist in the first place, it's dependent on the maker to make that phone for it to exist. Or maybe a better example, the sun. You can't have light shining from the sun without the sun in the first place. The light of the sun depends on the sun for it to exist. So this is contingent existence in a nutshell. Now, the universe is made up of parts like galaxies and planets, and the universe is always expanding. This is just basic science. If you argue that the universe was always there without a creator, this raises a logical absurdity and fallacy. You are basically saying that the universe is made up of parts that are all contingent existences until ad infinitum and eternity. Then you're also saying that the universe has been expanding until eternity. But how does something expand without there being a beginning point in its expansion? How does something expand without there being an initiation in its expansion? And how does a contingent dependent being, i.e. the universe made up of parts, cause its own expansion and own initiation when it depends on something else for its existence? Doesn't make any sense. The only logical solution is to stipulate that there is a necessary, self-sufficient, intelligent, and powerful being that is not contingent or dependent upon anything else for its existence, which is timeless and brought the universe into existence. And this is basically how we define God Almighty. I know a lot of people will still have many questions, despite how logical and understandable it is that there's only one true creator. Like, why would you believe in something you can't see? Well, have you ever cracked open your own skull and seen your own brain? Does that mean you don't believe your brain exists? because you can't see it. Have you ever seen the DNA test for your own mother? As far as you're aware, your mother is your actual mother. Why? There's enough logical clues to show you that these things are true. And in the same way, there's enough logical clues to show you that God exists. It's in your own natural disposition, fitrah, to want to believe in one God. Even if this wasn't enough to convince you, just ask yourself, would you rather live in a godless society where there is no objective moralism, no right or wrong, a society which could just crumble in a second? Or would you rather live in a society of true law and order that came from God Almighty? I know my answer. Let me know in the comments what's yours. Hope to see you in the next video, and Assalamu alaikum.